What happens when the person you entrust with your deepest self, your soul, turns out to be a predator? When the one meant to bring light and comfort becomes the embodiment of darkness. These aren't just crime stories. They're chronicles of betrayed trust, shattered faith, and a system that, for decades, allowed shadows to gather in the holiest of places. The legal system is meant to be a path to clarity and resolution, but for the victims of Father Michael Fuge of New Jersey, it became a frustrating labyrinth. Fuge was accused of sexual misconduct with a teenager in the 1990s, a charge that struck at the heart of his community's trust. In 2003, he was convicted, and it seemed that a measure of justice had been served. However, in a shocking turn, his conviction was later overturned on appeal due to a legal technicality, throwing the case back into uncertainty and forcing his victims to relive their trauma. The legal battle dragged on, a painful saga that highlighted how the complexities of the law can sometimes obscure the simple truth of a crime. Eventually, rather than face another trial, Fuge accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to a lesser charge. He received a sentence of probation and was permanently removed from ministry. While it was a legal conclusion, for many it lacked the moral force of the original conviction. This was a case not of innocence, but of a process that allowed a predator to evade the full weight of his actions. When the scales of justice are tipped by legal maneuvers and plea bargains, can it ever truly feel balanced? The case of Daniel McCormick serves as a chilling reminder that the crisis of abuse did not end with the initial wave of scandals in the early 2000s. Operating in the Chicago Archdiocese, McCormick committed his crimes against 5 boys in the early 2000s, a time when the church was publicly vowing transparency and reform. This made his betrayal all the more galling. He was a parish priest, a familiar face in his community, entrusted with the spiritual well-being of families. His crimes demonstrated a catastrophic failure of the new policies that were supposed to prevent exactly this kind of tragedy. The investigation into his case revealed that the Archdiocese of Chicago had received credible allegations against him, but failed to act decisively, leaving him in a position where he could continue to abuse. In 2007, he was convicted and sentenced to 5 years in prison. The case sparked immense public anger and led to accusations that the Archdiocese was still engaged in a cover-up, prioritizing its image over child safety. As one victim's attorney put it, "The system is still broken. If even after global scandal and promises of a new era, the same patterns of failure repeat, what does that say about the will for genuine change?" In Wisconsin, the St. John's School for the Deaf was supposed to be a sanctuary, a place where children, already navigating a silent world, could find safety, education, and community. Father Lawrence Murphy was a central figure there for over 2 decades, from the 1950s to the 1970s. He was powerful, respected, and to the children, an almost godlike authority. This authority, however, was the very tool he used to perpetrate unimaginable horrors. Murphy was accused of sexually abusing as many as 200 deaf children under his care. He exploited their inability to easily communicate with the outside world, creating a closed-off kingdom where his abuse went unchecked. The depth of the betrayal was staggering. He used the sacrament of confession to threaten his victims into silence, twisting a sacred rite into an instrument of terror. Because the crimes occurred so long ago, the statute of limitations had expired, and Murphy was never criminally prosecuted. He was quietly removed from ministry, but he died in 1998, having never spent a day in prison for his actions. Civil lawsuits and church investigations would later confirm the vast scale of his abuse, with internal documents revealing that church officials, even at the Vatican, knew of the allegations for decades. When the law cannot deliver justice, and an institution protects its own, What hope remains for the silenced? In the Archdiocese of Milwaukee, Father Robert V. Gale was a trusted member of the clergy. For years, he served in various parishes, his role placing him at the center of community life and in close contact with young people. But beneath this veneer of service lay a predatory secret. Gale was accused of sexually abusing boys during the 1980s, his crimes part of the larger explosive scandal that engulfed the Milwaukee Archdiocese. His case became emblematic of a systemic failure where warnings were ignored and predators were protected by a culture of secrecy. The investigation revealed a disturbing lack of oversight and a willingness by church leadership to prioritize the institution's reputation over the safety of children. In 2004, Gale was finally brought to justice, convicted of sexual assault. He was sentenced to a term of 4.5 to 7 years in prison, a sentence that many victims and advocates felt was shockingly lenient given the gravity of his betrayal. His case, along with others in Milwaukee, led to the release of thousands of pages of internal church documents, which one journalist called a blueprint of the cover-up. When the mechanisms of accountability within an institution are fundamentally broken, how can true justice ever be achieved? Paul Shanley was not a traditional priest. He was a self-proclaimed progressive, a prominent figure in the Boston Archdiocese, known for his street ministry and unconventional views. He cultivated an image as a champion of the marginalized, a rebel who understood the complexities of modern life. But this progressive veneer was a meticulously crafted mask for a predatory ideology. Shanley was a key figure in a scandal that rocked Boston, accused of raping and abusing boys over many years. His charisma was his camouflage, drawing in vulnerable youths who saw him as a friend and confidant. The trial in 2005 brought forth harrowing testimony, revealing a calculated pattern of abuse that began in the 1980s. Prosecutors argued that Shanley's public persona was a tool for grooming, a betrayal of trust so profound it was almost incomprehensible. He was convicted of raping a boy and sentenced to 12 to 15 years in prison. The most shocking turn, however, was his widely reported association with the North American Man-Boy Love Association, a connection that painted his crimes in an even more sinister light. He was released in 2017, a decision that horrified his victims and ignited public outrage. How does a society defend itself when the language of compassion and progress is hijacked to justify the most unforgivable evil? The case of Gilbert Gauta in Louisiana in the 1980s was a tremor that signaled a coming earthquake. In a community where the local priest was a cornerstone of society, Gauta was seen as a dynamic and beloved figure. He was charming, personable, and deeply integrated into the lives of his parishioners. This made the revelations of his secret life all the more devastating. In 1985, Gauta was convicted of molesting 11 boys, a crime that shattered the idyllic image of his parish. His case became one of the first in the United States to draw widespread public attention to the issue of clerical abuse, pulling back the curtain on a problem many refused to believe existed. The investigation revealed that Gauta's abuse was not a momentary lapse, but a compulsive pattern, and that the diocese had received complaints about him years earlier, choosing to move him rather than remove him. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, a significant sentence for the time. In court, the prosecutor described the church's actions as a shell game to hide problem priests. Gauta was paroled in 1995 after serving 10 years. His case forced a painful conversation, revealing how the trust and reverence afforded to clergy could be a predator's most effective shield. When the very person you are taught to confess your sins to is a predator in disguise, where does one turn for solace? James Porter was a ghost, a name that haunted dozens of parishes across Massachusetts and other states for decades. From the 1960s through the 1970s, he was moved time and again, leaving a trail of shattered lives in his wake. To the public, he was just another priest fulfilling his duties, but to a hidden community of survivors, he was a monster who wore a Roman collar. Porter's case became a landmark, one of the first to expose the full, horrifying scale of a single priest's predatory career. He was not just an abuser, he was a serial predator. With official accusations from over 100 individuals. His trial in 1993 was a landmark moment, forcing the Catholic Church into a public confrontation with its policy of shuffling abusive priests from one unsuspecting community to another. The testimony was heartbreaking, detailing a pattern of abuse that was systematic and relentless. He was ultimately convicted for abusing 28 children and sentenced to 18 to 20 years in prison. He died in custody in 2005. A report on his case noted that church officials knew he was a danger to children, but repeatedly reassigned him to roles with access to them. What does it say about a system when it knowingly and repeatedly places the fox in charge of the henhouse? The story of Joseph Jayapal stretches from the quiet communities of Minnesota to his native India, a testament to the fact that there is nowhere to hide from justice. Jayapal, a priest from India serving in the Diocese of Crookston, Minnesota, was a figure who brought an international flavor to his parish. But in the early 2000s, he committed a crime that would make him a fugitive. Accused of sexually abusing a teenage girl, Jayapal fled the United States and returned to India, hoping to disappear and evade prosecution. For years, it seemed he had succeeded. But American authorities did not give up. In a complex and lengthy process, they successfully sought his extradition. He was returned to the United States to finally face the charges against him. In 2015, in a move that frustrated many, he accepted a plea deal. He was convicted of criminal sexual conduct, but as part of the agreement, was sentenced to 1 year in prison, which he was permitted to serve in India. The resolution felt hollow to some, a negotiated justice that fell short of true accountability. How can a victim feel whole when justice is bartered and served thousands of miles away, a diluted consequence for an absolute betrayal? John Geoghegan was a name once synonymous with faith in the heart of Boston, a Catholic priest whose presence was meant to be a comfort. Yet behind the clerical collar and the gentle facade was a chilling duplicity, a darkness that festered for decades. Geoghegan was a predator moving in plain sight, a man whose transfers from parish to parish were not promotions, but a sinister trail of concealed crimes. For 30 years, he was a shadow that fell upon the most vulnerable, with accusations of abusing more than 130 children. The system that was meant to protect, instead protected him, shuffling him from one unsuspecting community to the next in a horrifying dance of complicity. It took the seismic investigation by the Boston Globe in 2002 to finally rip the veil of secrecy away, exposing a scandal that reached the highest echelons of the church. The subsequent trial was a litany of stolen innocence. Geoghegan was convicted of indecent assault and battery on a child and sentenced to 9 to 10 years. One victim's advocate stated, "He didn't just steal their childhood, he stole their faith." But his final judgment came not from a court, but from within prison walls. In 2003, he was murdered by a fellow inmate, a violent end to a life defined by quiet violence. When an institution designed for salvation becomes an accessory to damnation, how can the faithful ever truly feel safe again? Spiritual retreats are meant to be a time of profound reflection, a sacred space where individuals, often young people, seek to deepen their connection to their faith. Donald McGuire, a Jesuit priest, transformed these sanctuaries into his personal hunting grounds. For decades, from the 1960s into the 2000s, McGuire traveled across several states, leading retreats and workshops. He was charismatic, intelligent, and held a position of immense spiritual authority. It was this authority that he expertly weaponized to groom and abuse boys who came to him seeking guidance. His crimes were a deep spiritual violation, twisting moments of vulnerability and openness into opportunities for exploitation. The pattern of his abuse was methodical and widespread, making him one of the most prolific predators within the Jesuit order. In 2006, the law finally caught up with him. He was convicted of molesting boys and handed a sentence of 25 years, ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars. He died in prison in 2017. One survivor's testimony spoke of the crime as soul murder. How does a victim recover when the very person who was meant to guide them to God instead led them into a private hell? These are stories of how silence, driven by fear or a misguided sense of institutional loyalty, becomes complicity in crime. When authority is wielded as a weapon and sanctity used as a mask, the consequences ripple far beyond church walls. They erode belief in justice, in institutions, in the very possibility of a safe world for our children. These events have forced us to rethink power, accountability, and transparency. They've shown that no title, no status, should shield anyone from justice. The fight for justice for victims continues to this day, a long and painful process of healing, not just for individuals, but for society as a whole. We must ask ourselves tough questions. How can we, as a society, build systems to protect the vulnerable from betrayal by those with power and authority? And what steps are needed to restore trust in law enforcement and courts so that no crime goes unpunished because of someone's status or position? Share your thoughts in the comments. If this topic matters to you and you believe we need to talk about these issues, subscribe to the channel, give this a like, and hit the bell to stay updated on our next investigations. Only by shining a light on the darkest corners can we hope that one day the shadows will retreat.